You're going to hear things tonight you weren't meant to hear. And if you stay until the end, they will stay inside you. That's not a warning. That's a promise. There are places in this world that do not want you. They let you in, but only to decide what part of you they're going to keep. Iron Hill is one of them. It doesn't look like much on a map. A crooked rise east of Pike County, West Virginia. A scatter of trees that look dead even in summer. Soil the color of dried blood. Wind that refuses to move. And nothing built there ever stays warm. In the spring of 1917, a family moved in anyway. Not by accident. Not for a fresh start. They came for a reason that no one in the town of Ashford wanted to name aloud. You know, the kind of silence that isn't ignorance. It's survival. That's what Ashford had. They were called the Winthrops. A man, his wife, and their 3 daughters. They arrived at sunrise in a black wagon, the canvas cover pulled so tight it looked more like a hearse than a moving cart. No one remembers the horse, only the soundless motion of wheels turning in the dust, like a scene stripped of its audio. John Winthrop stepped down first. Mid-40s, gaunt, eyes that didn't just look at you, they measured you. Miriam followed, thin-lipped, her hands wrapped so tightly around a rosary that her knuckles looked carved from chalk. Then the girls, 3 of them, identical grey dresses, hair pulled straight back. None of them spoke, and one of them didn't blink. The postmaster, who'd been standing on the steps that morning, swore decades later that something about the way they moved wasn't right. Not wrong in the way strangers feel wrong. Wrong in the way time feels wrong when a clock stops ticking, but the hands keep shifting. John said they'd bought the old Ridge property, land no one in Ashford had touched in over 50 years, not since the last farmhouse, burned from the inside out, leaving no remains but a stone foundation and a blackened cellar door that no one dared open. The land wasn't for sale. There weren't even records of ownership anymore. But John had a deed, a lawyer's signature. Both belonged to a man who had died 6 weeks earlier. They smiled. They thanked the postmaster. They said they wanted a quiet life, and that was the last time anyone in Ashford saw any of them in daylight. No mail arrived. No one visited. The girls never appeared in school. The ridge above town grew wild and thick, a shadow in the landscape. But no one went to check. Not in 1917, not in Ashford. The first sign came with the birds, or rather, the absence of them. No song at dawn. No crows circling, no insects in the dusk. The ridge went silent, not the peaceful kind of silence, the kind that feels like a held breath waiting for something to answer it. By the second week, dogs refused to follow hunting trails that led anywhere near the hill. Horses would spin and sweat if their riders tried to point them toward it. The town's men stopped hunting in that direction. The women began pulling their curtains at dusk, and everyone agreed, without saying it aloud, that whatever the Winthrops had brought with them wasn't from here. Then came the sound. It started faint, a low vibration, like the bow of a violin drawn once across a single string. It wasn't coming from the house. It was coming from under it. By the end of the month, the vibration had deepened, split into multiple tones, harmonized in ways that didn't feel human, the kind of resonance that makes your teeth ache. People tried to explain it. Wind through stone, shifts in the earth, the echo of mining tunnels. But there were no mines, no fault line, and the sound only came between midnight and 3:03 a.m. 7 people in town began reporting the same dream, a cellar door buried in ash, something pounding from beneath it, not to escape, but to be remembered. Each dream showed the same crooked spiral carved into the doorframe. Millie Brennan, the town librarian, recognized the spiral immediately. She'd seen it before, in a church ledger from 1841, next to the name of a family excommunicated for speaking in borrowed tongues. Their surname, Winthrop. The town had always told itself the Winthrops were quiet, harmless, strange maybe, but not dangerous. That story cracked when Sheriff Cole McKinney received a letter with no return address, postmarked from the hill itself. Inside was a single sentence. It was never about them moving in. It was about what moved with them. McKinney saddled his horse and rode toward the ridge. He never returned. At dusk, his horse came back without him, foam on its flanks, eyes rolling white. Tied to the stirrup was a scrap of parchment, not paper, parchment, yellowed, frayed, written in smeared ink. They never left the chapel. Ashford didn't have a chapel anymore. The old one burned in 1911, but Millie remembered her grandfather telling her there'd once been two. The second wasn't a place of worship, it was a holding place. A prison, not for men, but for influence. And deep in the archives, Millie found its name, written in Latin, Domus a Vocis, the House of Voice. There had been a sub-level beneath the chapel, a room that didn't burn, and if the records were right, it wasn't empty. I'll tell you what was down there, but understand, when you hear it, you won't be able to unknow it. 3 nights after Sheriff McKinney vanished, the sound stopped. No hum, no vibration, just a dead, oppressive stillness that clung to the air like smoke. The people of Ashford thought it was over. They were wrong. On the 4th night, the lights came. Pale blue orbs, 5 of them, drifting above Iron Hill. They hung there in the black sky like lanterns on invisible strings. They didn't flicker. They didn't sway. They just watched. Some called it marsh gas. Others muttered about ball lightning. But the number, 5, was hard to ignore. 5 lights, 5 Winthrops. And by dawn, there were only 4. Sarah, the youngest daughter, was gone. Her bed neatly made, her nightgown folded at the foot like an offering, the door locked from the inside. On the blanket lay a book, black, no title, only the crooked spiral etched in a silver that shimmered when it caught the light. By that night, the humming had returned, but it wasn't the same. This time it had a rhythm, a slow, deliberate chant that felt less like a sound and more like something inside you vibrating in answer. The townsfolk reacted like animals before a storm. Curtains stayed drawn, candles burned in windows, bowls of salt appeared on every porch, and Miriam Winthrop, the woman no one had seen smile before, began to smile often, not out of joy, but recognition. She knew something the rest of Ashford didn't, and when Millie Brennan dug deeper, she found the hint in a letter written in 1789 by the mayor of a Pennsylvania town called Dalebrook. Dalebrook doesn't exist anymore. Every house left intact, every meal left on the table, not a single person found. The last line in the mayor's letter, they remembered her. That phrase appeared again in the margins of Miriam Winthrop's old school books. And now Millie began to see the pattern, a pattern stretching back centuries. Every 93 years, 5 members of a single bloodline gather in the same place, not to summon something, but to keep something down. The chant isn't an invitation, it's a lock. And the Winthrops, they weren't victims of Iron Hill, they were its jailers. But they'd failed. Sarah's disappearance meant the 5th voice was gone. Without it, the chant weakened. The lock began to fracture, and whatever was beneath Iron Hill, whatever Domus a Vocis was built to contain, was starting to listen. 3 days later, the wind shifted. It brought the smell of sulphur and wet stone down into Ashford. At 3:03 a.m., every weather vane in town turned toward the ridge, not east, not west, up. Then came the first vibration, not sound, memory of sound, like a bell that had been rung long ago, but whose echo was still pushing through the ground. Mrs. Kelter, blind since birth, woke screaming that the bell had cracked her dreams. Dogs refused to enter their own homes. Children began drawing spirals on walls, desks, and their own skin. And then the bell rang. No one heard it with their ears. They felt it in their spines, curling up from the base into the back of their throats. Every light in town went out, every mirror fogged from the inside. By morning, 5 homes, all belonging to Winthrop descendants, were empty, doors locked, beds made, food untouched, the clocks in every house frozen at 3:03. The chant had stopped, not because it had succeeded, because there was no one left to sing it. 3 weeks later, the Ashford Historical Society sent a team into the abandoned Winthrop house. They didn't come to investigate the supernatural. They came to claim artifacts before vandals did. What they found was worse than any haunting. The house wasn't decayed, no rot, no dust, no cobwebs. It was preserved, frozen, as if time itself avoided the place. The deeper they moved inside, the heavier the air became, not damp, but charged. In the back parlor, behind a warped bookshelf, they found a narrow stairwell leading down into the stone foundation. The steps were slick, the air was copper-sweet, like old blood. At the bottom was a door, no handle, just the crooked spiral burned deep into the wood. The hinges didn't creak when they forced it open. They sighed. Inside was a circular room no larger than 15 feet across. The walls were not stone but stacked books, their spines turned inward, each one labeled only with a year and a name. In the center on a slate pedestal was a small wooden chair, new, untouched by age. On its seat lay a single folded note. The fifth must return, or the room will call another. Then the sound began, not from outside, from inside the men. One dropped to his knees, humming in rhythm. Another carved spirals into the floor with his fingernails. Only one man escaped. He was found barefoot on Route 19, eyes clouded white, mumbling the same phrase over and over. She's learning how to wear them. She's learning fast. The others were never seen again. The room still exists beneath Iron Hill, and every year, on March 3rd at 3:03 a.m., the air above that hill stops moving, like something listening. And if you've stayed with me this long, you're already part of this. Type the words "The Fifth Returns" in the comments twice. Once for the algorithm, once for the lock, because if she's still listening, she's listening to you now. Long before the Winthrops built their house, before Ashford was a whisper of a town, there was the forest, thick, cold, root-bound. Locals called it the Weeping Thicket. It wasn't the trees that wept, it was the sound. A low, rhythmic moan that rolled through the trunks in winter. It didn't carry like wind, it moved through you. Hunters said it was the earth itself, grieving. But the elders had another name for it. The voice beneath. The rule was simple. If you heard the weeping, it had already heard you. And if it had heard you, the only safety was to be forgotten by it. In 1712, a small group of exiles from Massachusetts arrived at the base of the hill. They called themselves the Covenant of Elias. They had been cast out of their colony for heresy, but not for the reasons the court records claim. The court said witchcraft. The truth, and this comes from a single surviving diary, was that Reverend E. Elias Kerner claimed to have been contacted, not by an angel, not by a demon, but by something older than both. In his vision he saw a hill in a foreign wilderness, and beneath it a house without doors built of voices, kept closed by 5 keys that must sing as one. Kerner believed it was his calling to find it and guard it. When they reached the forest, they didn't build steeples or pews. They built circles, huge, precise rings carved into the ground with salt, ash, and burned cedar. Always oriented to magnetic north, always surrounding something in the center, a name written on parchment. Once a year, they would choose one person from their number, write their name, and bury it in the soil at the center of the ring. They called it giving the name back. It wasn't a sacrifice, it was insurance. You see, the voice beneath didn't hunger for flesh, it hungered for remembrance. If it knew you, it could wear you. The Covenant believed that by returning a name to the soil, they erased it from the voice's reach. And for a time, it worked. Then came the winter of 1729. The weeping grew louder, deep enough to rattle the glass in their lanterns. Animals fled the thicket in droves, deer, foxes, even the wolves abandoned their dens. The Covenant dug deeper around the hill, searching for the source. That's when they found the chamber. It was buried 20 feet below an outcrop of ironstone. A perfect circle, no entrances, no seams, just a smooth black wall that felt warm to the touch. And in its center, the spiral, not painted, not carved, grown. They tried to destroy it, burn it, scratch it, cover it. It was useless. The spiral seemed to absorb the heat, the light, even the sound around it, and when the Reverend placed his hand on it, the spiral moved, slowly, clockwise. That night, the weeping stopped, but something worse began. The people started humming in their sleep. At first, just 1 or 2, then the entire Covenant. The pitch matched the movement of the spiral. The Reverend wrote in his diary that it is as though the hill has learned our language and is teaching it back to us. Over the next 5 years, the Covenant dwindled, not by death, but by disappearance. They would simply walk into the thicket and never return. Those who remained grew gaunt, pale, their eyes black at the edges. They stopped speaking words entirely, communicating only in tones. By 1734, the settlement was abandoned. All that remained were the circles, the spiral, and a crude stone chapel the Reverend had ordered built over the chamber. Domus a Vocis, the house of voice. Its purpose was not to worship, It was to contain. The key was the chant. 5 voices, 1 bloodline. The Reverend had chosen 5 of his most loyal families and sworn them to guard the hill for generations. Every child born to those lines would learn the tones before they learned words. And every 93 years they would gather to reinforce the lock. The Winthrops were one of those families. The system worked for over a century, but here's the problem with bloodlines. They thin, families split, names are lost. And when the 5th voice is missing, the lock doesn't just weaken, it calls. That's the part no one outside the bloodline was ever told. The spiral is not just a symbol, it's a device, a mechanism designed not by human hands, but by the voice beneath itself. And like any mechanism, it can break. When Sarah Winthrop vanished in 1917, the spiral began to turn again. Slowly at first, then faster. The hum became a chant, the chant became a pattern, and the pattern was learning. The lock broke on October 12, 1737. It wasn't war or famine that caused it, it was arithmetic. The Covenant had already lost the Barrett line to sickness. That left 4 voices when the lock demanded 5. Reverend Kerner tried to compensate by splitting 1 voice, layering the tones with a drum, with bells, with wind through hollow reeds, but it didn't fool the mechanism. The spiral knew. That night, the humming began before the moon rose. It wasn't the low, almost comforting hum they'd heard before. This was jagged, hungry, like 1,000 voices speaking at once, but none of them fully human. The children woke first. They sat up in their beds, turned toward the window, and began to mimic the sound. No one told them to do it. Their parents tried to shake them, but the children's eyes rolled back and their mouths stretched into something too wide to be comfortable. Then came the smell, sweet, metallic, cloying, like flowers rotting in a jar of blood. It poured in from the forest, coating the air so thick that the settlers began to taste it on their tongues. The Reverend rang the iron bell to summon everyone to the chapel, but only half the settlement came. There, again, others walked into the trees, calm, purposeful, vanishing into the black. The lock had failed. When the Reverend and the survivors reached the spiral chamber, they found it open. Not physically, the black stone wall was still intact, but in the way a mirror is open, when it shows you something behind your shoulder that isn't there. The spiral was spinning, faster than it had ever moved. The air in the chamber was thick, vibrating. The humming was now words, not in English, not in Latin, a language of shapes, of directions, of sounds that curled in your skull and bent your thoughts toward them. 3 of the survivors fell to their knees, hands clamped over their ears. 1 began to laugh until he vomited blood. And then, it stepped through. It wasn't a body. It was a pattern, like a shadow cast by something you couldn't see but could feel. The Reverend described it in his diary as a thought given weight. It didn't move. It shifted. One moment it was a smear on the wall. The next it was inside your chest, whispering in your own voice about things you had never done but now remembered doing. It didn't kill the missing villagers. It erased them. Not just their bodies, but their place. Every ledger, every carving, every spoken recollection, gone. Even the people who loved them most could only say, "There was someone here once, but I can't remember their name." That's the part that made the Reverend truly afraid. Death leaves a hole. This left nothing. For 3 days, the spiral spun unchecked. The voice beneath roamed freely, not like a predator, but like a teacher moving through a class, finding the most receptive pupils. The Reverend tried to fight it. He rang the bell, burned the cedar, poured salt at the chapel door. None of it mattered, because the voice wasn't trying to come in, it was trying to take them out. On the 4th night, the Reverend made a choice. He and the last 4 loyalists stood in the chamber and began the chant. Without the 5th voice, it wouldn't be a lock. But maybe, just maybe, it would be a door that swung the other way. And it worked, not by sealing it, but by bargaining. The tones drew the spiral back into stillness, but not before the voice whispered a condition. 5 voices. Always. Or I will come as many times as it takes to teach you my name. The survivors swore the oath. The families were reduced to 4, but the Barrett name was kept alive on parchment, passed down as a placeholder. Whenever the 93 years came, someone would speak as Barrett, even if no true blood remained. That's why, for almost 2 centuries, Ashford was quiet. The spiral slept. The voice stayed behind the wall, but the problem with bargains is that both sides wait for the other to slip. And in 1917, when Sarah Winthrop vanished into the woods, the spiral began to turn again. The Barrett name was not spoken, the 5th voice was gone, and the voice beneath remembered its promise. The first sign wasn't Sarah's disappearance, it was the echo. In February of 1917, townsfolk began reporting a strange phenomenon inside their own homes. A voice, sometimes faint, sometimes loud, repeating their last sentence back to them, but not quite right. A fisherman named Arthur Colby was the first to describe it in detail. He told the sheriff, "I said, it's going to be a cold one tonight," and the thing came back with, "It's going to be cold inside tonight." Same tone, same breath, like I'd already decided it. No one thought much of it until more people heard it, in barns, kitchens, even in the church. Not an echo from outside, an echo from inside the walls. By April, it wasn't just words being repeated. It was thoughts. A school teacher claimed she heard herself humming a lullaby she hadn't thought of in years, coming from under her desk. The Winthrops knew what it meant. They didn't tell anyone. James Winthrop, patriarch of the family, wrote in his private ledger that the spiral had begun to move again, barely perceptible, but unmistakable. And more importantly, the movement was forward. This wasn't just random stirring, it was the pattern, the same sequence Reverend Kerner had described before the 1737 breach. James tried to assemble the voices. The other 3 bloodlines were still intact, though smaller, but the Barrett line, the phantom 5th voice, was missing entirely. The parchment name had been lost decades ago in a fire at the county clerk's office. Without it, there was no stand-in. On the night of June the 3rd, Sarah Winthrop vanished. She'd been seen walking to the family well at dusk, barefoot, wearing only a nightgown. The last person to see her was the maid, who said Sarah was answering someone I couldn't hear. The maid claimed Sarah paused, tilted her head as if listening to something far away, and then whispered, "I'll come where you are, but you have to stop calling me." They found her footprints in the dirt path, and then nothing. Bare soil, undisturbed, as if she'd stepped into the air and never come down. That's when the spiral accelerated. James sealed off the chamber, boarding up the chapel doors and posting guards. The family told the town the building was unsafe due to iron rot in the foundation, but every night the humming came louder, drifting into Ashford proper. It was strongest at 3:11 a.m., a time the Winthrops began referring to as the teaching hour. People began waking to the sound of their own voice, sometimes singing, sometimes laughing, sometimes whispering secrets they'd never told a soul. One man shot himself after hearing his own voice describe, in perfect detail, how he would die a week later, and then watching it happen exactly as spoken. James wrote, "It no longer hides in the walls, it stands beside the bed. It wears you until you forget which of you spoke first." By autumn, small objects began to disappear, not valuables, just personal items, a hairbrush, a pair of gloves, a child's shoe. But whenever something vanished, the owner reported feeling lighter, as if a memory tied to the object had been quietly erased. The sheriff wanted to investigate, but James bribed him to stay quiet. He told himself it was to prevent panic, but the truth was simpler. Panic would bring people into the chapel, and that's exactly what the voice beneath wanted. James's last entry in the ledger is dated November the 12th, 1917. "The spiral will not stop without the 5th. If no voice is found, we must bury the hill again. The earth will take it if we give enough, not lives, names." That night, a fire swept through the Winthrop estate. Officially, it was blamed on a faulty coal stove. Unofficially, the remaining Winthrops salted the ground where the house had stood and vanished from Ashford entirely. The chapel was left to rot, but the spiral didn't stop. It simply slowed, like a predator willing to wait, and the voice began to adapt, because this time it had learned something new. In 1737, it had reached into the village to claim its voices. Now, in 1917, it had found a way to make the village come to it. By the 1970s, Ashford was the kind of place people drove through without stopping. The population had shrunk to less than 500. The old chapel sat at the edge of town like a rotting tooth, its steeple crooked, its doors chained shut. Parents told their kids to stay away from it. Naturally, that made it irresistible. It started as a dare. Teenagers would creep up to the chapel at night, wedge open a window and slip inside. Most came back laughing, carrying splinters and a few rusted nails as trophies. But in 1979, a group of 5 didn't laugh. They were gone for less than an hour. When they returned, they walked side by side down Main Street without speaking. It wasn't until Sheriff Langston stopped them that they opened their mouths, and every one of them spoke at the same time in the same tone, in a language no one could recognize. Langston wrote in his incident report, "It was like hearing a choir where every voice was yours. They weren't looking at me. They were looking through me, like they were checking the room for someone I couldn't see." The sheriff drove them home. By morning, 3 of the 5 were gone. Their beds looked untouched, but their shoes were missing. The other 2 refused to speak about what they'd seen inside. Rumors started. Kids said the chapel smelled like wet cedar and copper, that the spiral on the floor wasn't painted but carved into the stone, deep enough to catch your finger if you traced it. One boy, 11 years old, told his friends he'd touched the spiral and felt something pull back, like a heartbeat under the floor. His friends dared him to do it again. He never made it. He stopped halfway down the aisle, turned to them and said, "It's already done with me." Then he collapsed. The coroner found no cause of death. His heart was perfect. His brain was untouched. But when his parents came to claim his body, they swore he looked thinner, not in weight, in presence. By 1985, the chapel had become the center of a local legend. Kids claimed that if you stood in the middle of the spiral and said your full name backwards, you'd hear a voice tell you the exact date you'd die. Some said it was just a game. Others never told anyone what they heard. That summer, 3 boys tried it. One ran out screaming and left town with his family the next week. The second boy laughed it off, saying the voice told him never. The third, the sheriff's son, told no one. He was found in the woods 3 days later, his footprints circling a single tree dozens of times, deeper and deeper into the soil, until they stopped completely. The sheriff boarded the chapel windows and posted warning signs. But by then, the damage was done. The voice beneath had learned something critical. It didn't need to call everyone, just the curious ones. The risk-takers, the ones who couldn't stand not knowing. And once it had them, it could use them as bridges. Neighbors began reporting strange things. A man sitting on his porch swore his wife came out to speak to him. Except she'd been at her sister's house 3 miles away. A girl woke in the night to find her mother standing at the foot of her bed, only for the real mother to come in seconds later from the hallway. A mechanic heard his own voice from under a car hood say, "You've already lost the hand," seconds before a jack slipped and crushed his wrist. And through it all, the spiral spun, faster than it had in 1917, but still slow enough to be patient. It wasn't rushing, it was choosing. By 1991, there were whispers in town about the 5th voice again. An old librarian named Doris Frayne claimed she'd found a page from James Winthrop's lost ledger inside a returned book. It read, "If the 5th cannot be found, the spiral will make its own, and it will not be bound by blood." 2 weeks later, Doris disappeared. The last person to see her said she was walking toward the chapel at dusk, barefoot, wearing a nightgown, just like Sarah Winthrop. The spiral wasn't sleeping anymore, it was recruiting. In 2003, Ashford got its first real attention from the outside world in decades. A cable network called Spirit Trackers picked it for an episode of their America's Forgotten Hauntings series. They weren't locals, they didn't know the rules. The crew arrived on a rainy Thursday in October. 2 hosts, a cameraman, a sound tech, and a producer named Keller. They rented rooms at the only motel in town, the kind of place where the wallpaper has a permanent dampness to it, and then started asking questions. The sheriff at the time, Dwayne Langston Jr., told them flat out to stay away from the chapel, but Keller smiled and said, "That's where the story is, right?" They went that night. The footage from their entry still exists, but only the first 11 minutes. In it, you can hear the wind outside and the hosts joking nervously as they step through the front door. The spiral is there on the floor, carved deep, just like the kids in the 80s said. One of the hosts, a woman named Dana, kneels down to touch it. She laughs and says, "It's warm. That's not possible." Then the sound tech interrupts. "Dana, say that again." She frowns. "What? You didn't just say, "It's warm, that's not possible." You said, "It's waiting, that's not possible." Dana swears she didn't. But when they play it back on the spot, the audio is clear. Same voice, same inflection, but different words. The cameraman keeps rolling. The spiral almost seems to ripple under the light, like water catching a current. Then there's a low hum on the audio, one that doesn't match any of their equipment. Keller says, "Do you guys hear that?" And Dana says, "It's not in the room, it's behind the room." At exactly the 11-minute mark, the camera tilts violently as if yanked down. There's a single frame, just one, of something standing at the far end of the chapel aisle. It's shaped like a person, but the proportions are wrong. Too tall, arms too long, head tilted at an angle that suggests the neck isn't what's holding it up. Then the footage cuts to static. The crew came back to the motel 2 hours later, pale and silent. Keller paid their bill in cash the next morning and they left without filming anything else in Ashford. The episode was never aired. 2 months later, the cameraman was found dead in his apartment in Boston. Neighbors complained about a smell. When police entered, they found his body seated in a chair facing a wall. On the wall, scratched deep into the plaster, was a spiral. Perfect, unbroken, and carved down to the brick. Dana was admitted to a psychiatric facility in upstate New York after telling her sister she could hear her own name walking around outside. She refused all visits, saying, "If you see me, it'll wear you too." Keller simply vanished. No one filed a missing person report. It's like he was erased. But here's the part most people don't know. A month after the crew left, the sheriff's office got a package in the mail. No return address. Inside was a mini DV tape, unmarked except for a strip of masking tape with the number 5 written on it. The footage is just Keller sitting in a motel chair staring into the camera. He doesn't blink. After 3 minutes of silence, he says, "The spiral doesn't need to move anymore. It's in me. It's already in you." Then he smiles, not the smile of someone happy, the smile of someone relieved. The tape ends with Keller walking toward the camera, filling the frame with his face, until his eyes are the only thing visible. They look glassy, like there's water moving just under the surface. The sheriff locked the tape in the evidence room. 2 years later, the evidence room burned down in what was officially called an electrical fire. The spiral was patient enough to wait, but not patient enough to leave loose ends. That was the last time outsiders came to film, for a while, because the thing about a story like Ashford's is, you can try to bury it, you can even burn it, but all you really do is make people more curious. And curiosity in Ashford is just an open door. By 2013, the internet had made Ashford into a kind of digital campfire story. You couldn't find much at first, just half-broken forum threads, blurry photos of the chapel's crooked steeple, and the occasional post from someone claiming to have heard the hum while driving past the edge of town. But then the blogs arrived. True crime bloggers are a stubborn breed. They don't believe in curses, they believe in unsolved cases, which meant Ashford was perfect for them. Dozens of disappearances, no convictions, no coherent timeline. The first was a woman named Lydia Moore, a freelance writer from St. Louis. She drove down alone one weekend, hoping to write a debunking piece. She checked into the same roadside motel the Spirit Trackers crew had used a decade earlier. Her blog's final post went up at 2:14 a.m., timestamped just 3 hours before she was last seen. "It's not the chapel. It's the shape. I've seen it twice today, in a puddle, and in the rings on the table in my room. It's not waiting for me. It's waiting for the 5th. Her car was found in the motel parking lot. Her room key was still on the nightstand. Her laptop was open, the cursor blinking at the end of that post." The sheriff's office scrubbed the entry from her blog within 48 hours, citing an active investigation. But by then, screenshots were everywhere. YouTubers took notice next. In 2016, a channel called Night Lens, known for its urban exploration videos, uploaded a teaser. 2 masked figures standing in the chapel doorway, one of them holding a flashlight beam on the spiral. The thumbnail alone got hundreds of thousands of views. The full video was supposed to go live the next day. It never did. Instead, the channel posted a 6-second clip titled, "Listen Closely." It was just audio, a low, steady hum like a refrigerator running in another room. But under it, almost hidden, was something else, a voice whispering numbers. The numbers didn't make sense at first. until a fan slowed the audio to 1/4 speed and realized they were dates. Not in the past, in the future. Every single date corresponded to the birthday of a subscriber. Comments exploded. People joked, others panicked. A few claimed that when they played the clip at night, they heard the hum continue for hours after the video ended. Then, one by one, the commenters stopped replying. No official link was ever made between their disappearances and the video, but within 6 months, Nightlens deleted their entire channel. Their accounts went dark. Their merchandise store, bank accounts, even their domain name, all vanished on the same day. Here's the thing the bloggers and YouTubers never understood. The spiral didn't need you to be in Ashford anymore. It just needed your attention. Every retelling, every click, every time someone replayed that audio. It was like tracing the grooves with your finger. You weren't safe just because you were hundreds of miles away. You'd already stepped inside. That's when the fifth voice returned. Not in the chapel, not even in Ashford, but in videos, live streams, and late-night phone calls to people who had never heard of the town before. A college student in Oregon claimed his dorm's smoke detector began beeping in patterns. He recorded it. When he uploaded the clip, a sound engineer noticed the beeps were spaced to match the cadence of speech. Filtered through software, they formed a single sentence: "I'm still looking." A barista in Chicago found a spiral drawn in condensation on the inside of her cafe's front window, the glass between her and the street. The problem? She'd just opened and no one had been inside. And then, in 2019, the first confirmed long-distance disappearance. A man named Trevor Goss, who ran a podcast about unsolved mysteries, went missing during a live recording. You can still hear it. He's mid-sentence, describing the Nightlens incident. When he stops, there's a 10-second pause. Then you hear him say, in a voice that doesn't sound like his own, "You came to me. I don't have to come to you." The mic picks up the sound of a chair scraping back, and then nothing. The call stayed connected for another hour. The only thing on the track is that faint hum. The police treated it like a domestic disappearance. His listeners knew better. By the end of the decade, Ashford wasn't just a cursed place on a map. It was a pattern, a shape, a sound, and patterns. Travel. The pandemic changed everything. In early 2020, the chapel doors had been locked for years, the roof sagging under decades of storms. Ashford was a ghost town within a ghost town. Boarded windows, shuttered shops, a post office that hadn't stamped a letter in a decade. But the world was online, and the spiral had been learning. It began with a live stream. A Twitch channel called Echo Path, normally a gaming stream, was running a 24-hour charity event. Halfway through, the chat noticed something strange. The streamer's face cam began to distort, not with the usual pixelation of bad internet, but with a shifting, curling shape at the edges of the frame. One viewer took a screenshot. When you rotated it 90 degrees, the distortion became unmistakable. A spiral, made not of lines but of fragments of the streamer's own face, looping endlessly inward. Minutes later, the streamer froze mid-sentence, eyes locked on something off-screen. Then he said, "Don't look away. It'll have to leave if you don't blink." And then, the feed cut to black. The charity stream ended early. No one heard from him again. It wasn't just Twitch. Zoom calls began glitching. The kind of glitch where someone's frozen frame doesn't match their actual last expression. People started capturing stills of co-workers mid-meeting, their mouths forming words no one heard live. One woman swore that in the background of a frozen screen, she saw an aisle, wooden pews on either side, and at the far end, something tall. It escalated fast. Instagram reels appeared showing quick cuts of small-town scenery. A street sign for Ashford Ard, spelled without the E. A church steeple. A spiral painted in chalk on a sidewalk. Users swore they didn't make them. Some of the accounts had been inactive for years. Then came the sound files. It started as a TikTok trend. People sharing a strange audio clip they claimed cured insomnia. It was the hum, the same pitch from Nightlens, the same depth. But now, hidden under it, was a slow-breathing sound, too slow to be human. A sound engineer tried mapping the hum's frequency against standard resonance charts. He discovered it matched the vibrational profile of certain underground structures, tunnels, chambers, but with one critical difference. It didn't fade over time. It intensified. He posted his findings. 2 days later, his account was wiped clean. The spiral wasn't just haunting content anymore. It was creating it. And then, it stepped through. January 2023. A popular paranormal investigator named Rosa Lee was live streaming from her apartment in Philadelphia. She wasn't in Ashford. She'd never even been to Ashford. But she'd been researching it for months, collecting every forum post, every distorted clip, every scrap of the hum she could find. Halfway through her stream, she froze. Chat thought it was lag until she whispered, "It's here." The camera feed warped. Her apartment behind her seemed to stretch, walls bending away like pulled rubber. And then, for just one frame, the chat saw it. The same tall figure from the Spirit Tracker's footage, head tilted, arms long enough to almost scrape the floor. Rosa screamed. The camera fell sideways. The stream stayed live for another 6 minutes, showing nothing but the spiral burned into her hardwood floor. Police entered her apartment later that night. Rosa was gone, but her computer was still streaming. No one touched it. For the next 20 minutes, every viewer in the chat reported the same sensation, the smell of rain-soaked wood, the sound of breathing in their own rooms. Some swore the spiral appeared in their vision every time they blinked. When the stream finally went offline, dozens of accounts in the chat were deactivated simultaneously. No one knows how many people went with her. Now, in 2025, Ashford isn't a location anymore. It's a transmission. You don't have to step inside the chapel. You don't have to see the spiral on the floor. You just have to watch, listen, retell, and every time you do, you make the grooves deeper. You keep it alive. You've already made it this far. You've pictured the chapel. You've heard the hum in your head, even if it's just your imagination. But you should know by now, imagination is exactly how it gets in. The oldest written trace doesn't come from police reports, property deeds, or even church records. It comes from a diary. In 1874, the land where Ashford now stands was a scattered cluster of farms known locally as Grey Hollow. There was no chapel then, just a small meeting hall where farmers gathered on Sundays to barter goods and share news from town. The diary belonged to a woman named Maria Kell. She was 19 when she began writing in it, newly married to a man twice her age, a wheat farmer who had built their home on the edge of the hollow. Her entries at first are simple, descriptions of the weather, the birth of calves, the ache in her hands after mending clothes by candlelight. Then, in March of 1875, her handwriting changes. The first shift is subtle. Her neat loops become cramped, letters pressed into the page as if she's leaning too hard. Then the words themselves darken. The rain has not stopped in 5 days. I saw shapes in the puddles. I think the puddles are watching me. 2 weeks later, I found the mark again, in the flour dust on the table. It was not there when I woke. Thomas says I drew it myself without knowing, but I would not draw such a thing. It pulls at my eyes. By April, her entries begin to include sketches. Circles within circles, always slightly uneven, as though drawn from memory. But one sketch is different. The spiral is perfect. Too perfect for a hand-drawn shape. And at the center, she's written, "There is a fifth seat at the table." The very next page is dated April 19th, 1875, and it is almost illegible. The words run to the edges of the paper, no margins, no breaks. She repeats the same sentence 34 times. It is not a door if it does not open. Then the diary goes blank for 3 months. When the entries resume in July, Maria's tone is calm again, but something is wrong. She never mentions Thomas. She writes about tending the fields, but in every entry she adds a single line at the end. The hum is louder now. Local law says Thomas Kell vanished that summer. No record of his burial exists, and his name disappears from tax rolls after 1875. The last entry in Maria's diary is dated August the 12th. It reads, "The fifth seat is full. I do not think I will write again. If you find this, do not draw it. Do not follow it. If you must look, do not blink." The diary was discovered in 1912, hidden beneath the floorboards of the farmhouse, long abandoned by then. A local historian catalogued it, but kept it in his personal collection. It passed through 2 more owners before being donated to the county archive in 1979. That's where things get stranger. The archivist assigned to catalogue it reported that every photograph of the spiral sketch came out blurred. Not motion blur, but a distortion in the print itself, as though the paper warped during exposure. Digital scans failed too. The image file would corrupt within seconds. One intern, frustrated, traced the spiral by hand so it could be preserved in a book on local history. She made it through 3 loops before her nose began to bleed. She never finished it. She also never came back to work. That hand-traced copy is now locked in a climate-controlled vault, marked Access Restricted. The original diary is still there too, though staff say it has begun to smell faintly of damp wood, like the floorboards of an old church after rain. Which raises the real question. The chapel in Ashford wasn't built until 1892. Maria Kell's diary predates it by 17 years, so where did she see the spiral? Some researchers believe there was an older structure, not a chapel, but something beneath the ground, a chamber used for gatherings before Grey Hollow was even settled. They think the spiral wasn't decoration but a map that didn't lead somewhere, but led out. And if that's true, the chapel wasn't built to worship anything. It was built to keep something in. In 1892, the townsfolk of Grey Hollow gathered to bless the foundation stone of what would become the Chapel of St. Audran. Officially, the project was a sign of progress, proof the hollow was no longer a scattering of farms, but a community worthy of a proper house of worship. Unofficially, people whispered that the church council had been urged by a benefactor from Philadelphia. No one knew his name. He never appeared in public, but every week money arrived for supplies, equipment and wages for the laborers. The ground chosen for the chapel wasn't random. It was the exact site of the old Kell farmhouse, abandoned since 1875, its timbers rotted and its foundations swallowed by creeping vines. No one seemed to mind building over it. The first trouble came when they dug the foundation. Workers found stone not native to the region, smooth slabs etched with faint curling patterns. At first, the foreman ordered them broken up and carted away, but one mason, a man named Daniel Fitch, refused to touch them. "They're still warm," he told his crew. The others laughed until they touched the stones themselves. Within days, Daniel became obsessed. He told others the markings weren't patterns but instructions, a kind of path meant to be followed with the eyes. "You have to start in the center," he'd mutter over lunch, tracing invisible shapes on the air. By winter, he wasn't eating. By spring, he was gone. His tools were found in neat rows beside the open foundation pit, a spiral scratched into the dirt at the bottom. Construction halted for only 2 weeks before the foreman declared work must go on. Then came the night of June 14th, 1894. 5 men were assigned to the site for overnight security, guarding the lumber and stone from thieves. Sometime after midnight, a thunderstorm rolled over the hollow. Neighbors claimed they heard singing beneath the thunder, not hymns but a single droning note that swelled until it rattled the window glass. At dawn, the foreman arrived to find the site empty. The rain had pooled in the open foundation, and in the center, carved into the mud itself, was a perfect spiral. The sheriff organized a search. They found no bodies, no footprints leading away, nothing but a single boot lodged between 2 stones. Inside the boot was the forefinger of one of the guards. The flesh was unmarked, but the nail had been scraped clean off, as if by grinding against stone. The foreman wanted to fill the pit with gravel and start again, but the mysterious benefactor intervened. A letter arrived instructing them to preserve the mark and set it in place with sanctified wood, and so they built the chapel's floor around it. Witnesses say the spiral was laid in black walnut, darker than the surrounding boards, its grooves filled with oil that never seemed to dry. Children were warned not to step inside it during services. By the time the chapel was consecrated in 1895, most of the townsfolk believed the spiral was merely symbolic, a flourish in the floorwork, like the labyrinths in old European cathedrals. But the masons knew better. One of them, years later, would tell his grandson a different version of events, that during the final week of construction, a man came to inspect the floor. Tall, narrow-shouldered, dressed in black despite the summer heat. He stood at the edge of the spiral and tilted his head as if listening. Then he looked at the masons and said, "You built it the wrong way, but it will still open." When the grandson asked what he meant, the old man refused to say. The chapel would stand for less than 2 decades before its first collapse. But the spiral survived. When the building was rebuilt in 1914 after a fire, the floor was restored exactly as before. The grooves of the spiral deepened and sealed beneath a fresh coat of oil, and that, according to some, was the real mistake. By the winter of 1913, the Chapel of St. Audran had settled into the rhythm of small-town life. Weddings, funerals, Sunday sermons. No one mentioned the 5 men who vanished during construction anymore, at least not openly. The spiral on the floor was simply part of the church, like the pulpit or the bell tower. Children dared each other to run its loops after service, while their parents pretended not to notice. Some swore they could hear faint ringing in their ears while standing inside it, but chalked it up to childish imagination. Then came December 3rd. The day had been bitterly cold, the kind that freezes your breath into brittle clouds. That evening, the annual winter vigil service was being held, candles lit in every window, choir rehearsing for the midnight mass. By 9:00 p.m., the chapel was warm with bodies, every pew filled. At 9:14, the first scream cut through the hymn. Witnesses remember the sound as sharp, animal-like. Heads turned toward the altar, where one of the altar boys had dropped his candle. Wax splattered across the walnut floor. Before anyone could move, the flames seemed to spread sideways, racing along the grooves of the spiral in a perfect line. The oil that had been rubbed into the wood for nearly 20 years ignited instantly. Panic erupted. Parishioners surged toward the doors, but the smoke was thick, black, and rolling low. By the time the church bell rang an alarm, the entire floor was a pulsing ring of fire. The strange part, and this detail appears in multiple sworn statements, was that the flames didn't behave like normal fire. They didn't leap upward. They didn't consume the boards. Instead, they crawled along the grooves, spiraling inward, brighter and brighter, as though something at the center was pulling the heat toward it. That's when the first firefighter went missing. The Ashford Volunteer Brigade arrived at 9:23. 3 of them, Joseph Latimer, twins Benjamin and Henry Cartwright, entered through the south transept with hoses and axes. A dozen people saw them step onto the spiral. A dozen people also saw them vanish, not burn, not fall, vanish. It was like a camera cut between frames. They were there 1 second, gone the next. Their gear clattered to the floor, still smoking. The surviving firefighters refused to go back inside. Instead, they drenched the walls and ceiling, containing the blaze until the roof collapsed inward at 10:06 p.m. The fire, oddly, didn't spread to the surrounding buildings. The next morning, townsfolk picked through the ashes. Every pew was reduced to charcoal, every beam cracked and blackened, and yet, in the center of the ruin, the spiral remained. The boards were unburnt, the grooves were still oiled, and now they were warm. No bodies were recovered, not from the fire, not from the foundation. The Latimer and Cartwright families buried empty coffins. The inquest that followed was inconclusive. The official cause of the fire was listed as candle accident during service, but several attendees testified under oath about what they'd seen. The sideways movement of the flames, the impossibility of the wood's survival, the sudden disappearance of the men. The county coroner refused to sign off on death by fire for the missing. His notes, later found in his effects, read, "Not burned, taken, spiral still warm, someone will open it again." After the fire, the congregation met in the schoolhouse, but by spring of 1914, letters began arriving from the same mysterious benefactor who had funded the original chapel. Enclosed in each was a check, large enough to pay for complete reconstruction with one stipulation: the spiral must be preserved. The builders did more than preserve it. They deepened the grooves, replacing the walnut with ebony shipped from overseas, polishing it until it drank the light from the windows. The oiled surface gleamed like a wet stone. When the new chapel opened that autumn, the spiral was again at the center, as if the fire had never happened. If you believe the archivists, the spiral was never meant to be decoration. It was meant to be fed. By 1936, the chapel of St. Audran had survived 2 decades without another public tragedy. The townsfolk still whispered about the winter vigil fire, but the memories were fading. New families had moved in. New stories filled the nights. Still, no one stepped into the spiral without a dare. On October 18th, the chapel was full again, this time for the funeral of Jonathan Mallory, a respected local banker, husband and father of 3. Mallory had died in his sleep, his passing attributed to heart failure. His coffin, polished oak with brass handles, rested at the front of the church, directly before the altar, directly over the spiral. The service began without incident. Hymns swelled. The priest, Father Kellen, spoke of Mallory's generosity and quiet strength. It was a chilly autumn day, the air inside tinged with the scent of fallen leaves and candle wax. Then, midway through the second reading, the coffin moved. Not much, just a subtle shift, like something inside had rolled toward one side. A murmur ran through the congregation. Father Kellen paused, glanced at the pallbearers. Before anyone could speak, the coffin's lid slid an inch. Several witnesses later swore they heard a faint sound from within. Not knocking, not a voice, a low, rhythmic scraping, like fingernails over polished wood. The pallbearers stepped forward to adjust the lid. That was when the thing happened, the moment Grey Hollow would never forget. The coffin shuddered violently, as if struck from the inside. The brass latch snapped. The lid swung open. Inside was not Jonathan Mallory. The figure in the coffin was a man, yes, but taller, thinner, with skin the color of paper left in a drawer for 100 years. His eyes were open. The whites were jaundiced yellow, the pupils so dilated they swallowed most of the iris. His suit was unfamiliar, cut in an old style, the cloth stiff and dry as parchment. Most unsettling of all was his mouth. It was stretched into a small, tight smile, the kind you see on someone who has already heard the answer to the question you're about to ask. The scraping hadn't stopped. It was still happening, not from his hands but from beneath him. The bottom of the coffin was moving, warping. The wood beneath his back was flexing, bending inward toward the spiral beneath the altar. Someone screamed. The priest dropped his Bible. In the commotion, the figure in the coffin turned his head, slowly with a sound like cracking twigs, and looked toward the congregation. Several people fainted. One woman began shouting a name no one recognized. The grooves of the spiral had gone black, the oil bubbling as though heated from below. Something thick was seeping upward through them. Not water, not oil. It was darker, heavier. It clung to the air, coating the chapel with a smell like rust and damp earth. The figure in the coffin closed his eyes, and then he sank. There is no other word for it. He did not roll out, did not fall. He sank straight down, coffin and all, into the floor. The wood seemed to ripple, swallowing him until only the spiral remained, its grooves steaming. When the sheriff arrived, he found the mourners scattered, some outside sobbing, others refusing to come within 10 feet of the chapel door. Father Kellen was kneeling at the altar, muttering prayers over and over, his hands shaking. There was no coffin, no Jonathan Mallory, only the spiral still wet. The death certificate for Mallory was quietly amended that winter. Cause of death: undetermined. The original coroner's report vanished from county records. Mallory's widow left Grey Hollow with her children 2 weeks later, abandoning their home and bank accounts. The house stood empty until the 1950s. In the years after, the spiral was more than avoided. It was feared. Parishioners began attending services at other churches. Weddings moved to the courthouse. The few funerals held at St. Audryn were conducted without coffins, just urns. But the spiral remained, always warm. By the summer of 1987, the chapel of St. Audryn was more relic than place of worship. The roof sagged, pigeons nested in the bell tower, and ivy crawled thick up the stone walls. The congregation had dwindled to fewer than a dozen elderly regulars, and even they admitted they came more out of habit than devotion. The town council, faced with either tearing the chapel down or preserving it as a historic landmark, voted for restoration. A construction crew was hired to replace the roof, repair the stonework, and refinish the wooden floor. That last part was the mistake. The crew arrived in late June, 5 men and a foreman named Edward "Eddie" Calhoun, a lifelong resident of Grey Hollow. Eddie had grown up hearing the spiral stories, but like most locals under 50, he dismissed them as superstitious nonsense. The first few days went smoothly, scraping old paint, replacing warped beams, repairing the altar rail. Then, on the 4th day, Eddie decided to tackle the spiral. The wood was still strangely well preserved compared to the rest of the floor, its ebony boards gleaming even under decades of dust. The grooves were packed with old, hardened oil. Eddie, wanting to impress the council, decided to sand the whole thing down to bare wood and refinish it the proper way. At 11:42 a.m., the power sander hit something unusual. The sound shifted, from the rough hiss of sanding to a deep, almost hollow hum. Eddie frowned, shut the sander off, and bent to examine the groove. The air above it shimmered faintly, like heat over asphalt. He reached down, running, his fingers along the groove and jerked his hand back. It was warm, not just from friction. "Probably a heat pipe under here," he joked to one of the workers. But there were no heat pipes in the chapel floor. Everyone knew that. Eddie turned the sander back on and pressed it harder into the groove. That was when the floor exhaled. The crew would later describe it as a rush of warm air smelling of soil, rust, and something sweet, like rotting fruit. The dust in the sunbeams swirled in lazy spirals, and then the groove under Eddie's sander split. Not cracked, not splintered, but opened, a perfect dark line widening like a mouth. The sander's spinning pad vanished into the gap. Eddie yanked backward, but his boots were already over the groove. One of the workers shouted his name. Eddie looked up, and then he was gone. No scream, no flailing. He simply dropped straight down into darkness, as if the floor had never been there. The sander cord snapped taut, sparking where it ripped from the outlet. The crew froze for maybe 3 seconds before chaos erupted. One man bolted for the door, another began shouting for someone to grab a flashlight. But before anyone could move, the groove sealed. It didn't close like wood settling, it simply wasn't open anymore. Eddie was gone. The sheriff's office arrived within the hour. They examined the floor, found nothing but smooth, oiled ebony. They tapped it, pried at it, even used a crowbar. Solid wood. No hollow space beneath, no crawl space. Officially, Eddie Calhoun was declared a missing person. Unofficially, the other workers refused to set foot back in the chapel. The restoration halted. Later, one of the crew, a man named Harold Pike, admitted to the sheriff that in the moment Eddie vanished, he'd heard something under the floor. Not a voice exactly, more like a low, wet swallowing. By autumn, the chapel was closed off entirely. The town council erected a locked fence around it, citing structural instability. But the spiral remained untouched, waiting in the dust and silence. The next time it would open would not be by accident, and it would not be patient. By 2019, the chapel of St. Audran had been abandoned for over 30 years. The roof had partially collapsed, ivy had thickened into a wall of green, and the spiral was just another urban legend in the endless ocean of ghost stories online. For a certain kind of person, that made it irresistible. The person in question was 23-year-old Daniel Kerrick, a live streamer with a modest following who specialized in dark history exploration videos. He was not reckless, at least not in his own mind. He researched his locations, carried backup lighting, and always had an escape route. In early October, Daniel posted a teaser video. Gray Hollow, Pennsylvania, the Chapel of St. Audran. They say the floor eats people. Let's find out. The comments were half mocking, half thrilled. On the night of October 12th, Daniel parked a few streets away and hiked to the chapel. He carried a high-lumen flashlight, a GoPro on his chest, and a small drone in his backpack. His phone streamed directly to thousands of viewers. The chapel interior was exactly as he'd imagined. Damp, dusty, littered with old pews collapsed into themselves. His camera lingered on the altar. The spiral was still there. The first odd thing happened about 7 minutes into the stream. As Daniel stepped toward the altar, the chat began spamming messages like, "Bro, the floor moved. Rewind. Something shifted in the spiral. Is it breathing?" Daniel laughed it off, pointing his flashlight directly at the floor. Nothing unusual. The grooves looked deeper than he'd expected, but that was just age, he told the viewers. At exactly 9:42 p.m., the livestream audio picked up a low hum. Not mechanical, not environmental. It rose and fell in slow waves, like someone exhaling through a hollow reed. Daniel crouched beside the spiral, holding the flashlight close. The grooves glistened. "All right," Daniel said, grinning into the camera. "Let's get a closer look." He reached out and touched the wood. His smile faltered. "It's warm," he muttered. "Like body temperature warm." The chat exploded. Daniel set the flashlight on the floor, its beam steady on the spiral. Then he pulled a small folding knife from his pocket and began scraping at the hardened oil in the grooves. For the first few seconds, nothing happened. Then the wood beneath his blade shivered. It didn't splinter, didn't crack. It moved. The livestream audience saw it before Daniel did. In the chat, lines of "Oh God" and "It's opening" scrolled faster than he could read. The groove directly under Daniel's hand widened, a precise dark slit. Warm air rushed upward, fogging the flashlight lens. Daniel jerked back, swearing, but the movement was too late. The spiral pulled. The camera caught everything. Daniel's hands splayed on the floor as his knees slid forward, his shoes leaving dusty streaks. His face snapped toward the camera, eyes wide, mouth open as if to yell something, but no sound came. The viewers watched as his body dropped vertically, as if a trapdoor had opened beneath him, though the wood didn't break or splinter. The spiral simply widened around him, swallowing him whole. The flashlight rolled toward the groove, tipped halfway in, and then was gone. The floor sealed without a trace. The live stream didn't cut off. The viewers sat staring at the empty frame, the altar in perfect focus, the spiral untouched. And then, 43 seconds after Daniel vanished, something moved. It was not Daniel. It was a hand, pale, long-fingered, the skin stretched too tightly over the bones. It reached up through the groove, palm flat against the floor, and then slowly, deliberately, it pressed downward and disappeared. The spiral gleamed wetly for a moment, then went still. The video was pulled from most platforms within hours, flagged for graphic and disturbing, incontent. But fragments survived, shaky phone recordings, partial screen captures. To this day, no trace of Daniel Kerrick has been found, and the chapel of St. Audran still stands. The spiral is still there, and if you go close enough, some nights, you can feel it breathing.